This to me is like the really fascinating material.
We don't know what the answer is, but we're looking for patterns.
I think we're looking at kind of a type of cosmic alchemy.
The story slowly grew into mythos.
Still, a lot of people don't know that this technology actually exists.
The possibilities here are pretty mind-boggling.
We can't just believe that it was the work of these lone troubled individuals.
Welcome, guys, to Conspirinormal. We are in full effect for our Halloween shows that are coming up. And we do have a guest starting out, but Rob, how you doing?
I am wonderful. Thank you for asking.
You haven't fallen apart yet. You got to meet Ween, so that was good.
I did. Yeah, I got to meet the guys from Ween. That was as interesting as you'd expect.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that. We're kind of got an interesting little two-part show tonight. And Mr. Surfiel, you've actually found this guest that we're about to talk to. So if you can kind of introduce him, we'll go ahead and get started with the interview.
Yeah, I found this this book was at a friend of mine's house, and they know I'm into paranormal stuff and local history. So I asked to borrow it, and they kindly let me, and thought it'd be a good show idea for a Halloween episode. The book is Dark and Bloody Ground, Strange Tales of the Dark and Bloody Ground, Authentic Accounts of Restless Spirits, Haunted Honky Tonks, and Eerie Events in Tennessee by Mr. Christopher K. Coleman. And he is our guest tonight. Introduce yourself, Mr. Coleman.
Well, I appreciate your having me on the show. I've been in Nashville, in the Middle Tennessee area for several decades, and I'm originally a damn Yankee, but
that's okay.
I've made Nashville my home. And when I first moved here, when I was a kid, just to tell you how far back it goes, I was a kid. I used to watch The Twilight Zone, and there was a show called One Step Beyond, which I always loved. And the One Step Beyond was based on true tales of the paranormal and the unexplained. So I kind of, like I said, bit my teeth on that when I was a kid. But and I was also a Civil War buff too. But I had no idea that any of that related to Nashville or the Middle Tennessee area when I moved here. That was for personal reasons. And then bit by bit, started picking up on things that coincidentally seemed to fit in with my previous interests. Like I had no idea that Nashville had anything to do with the Civil War. Meanwhile, it turns out Nashville was Civil War Central, or paranormal. Like one story when I was a small kid I heard about was the disappearance of David Lang. Turns out we moved up to Sumner County only a few miles from where his disappearance allegedly took place. Now that's kind of the disappearance of David Lang is kind of complicated, and some people say it's a total fabrication, but other things like, I was just talking about the day it rained blood and gore in Wilson County. That was something I read originally in Charles Fort. Anybody out there who's familiar with Charles Fort in Fortiana, there's a whole discipline out there devoted to his works. Basically, things that happen that science cannot explain. And that's the long and short of it. And some of the weirdest things, like people have reported fish falling from the sky or frogs, things like that. Now, it's not the scientists hate unexplained phenomena, so they always dream up excuses for it. But the truth of the matter is, nobody's really come up with an adequate explanation, a real explanation, instead of just a rationalization. And things like bloody rain is even rarer and even weirder than normal Fortean falls. And that did happen in Wilson County. It was back before the Civil War. And basically, like I said, I devote a whole chapter to it in Strange Tales of the Dark and Bloody Ground. But a farmer named E.M. Chandler, of course, this was back before the Civil War, so his tobacco crop was being tended by his slaves. And in the middle of the day, they came running up to the house and had a strange tale to tell. They were farming, tending to the tobacco crop. I guess it was early August, and suddenly out of the sky came first drops of blood, and then actual pieces of flesh falling all over the place. And the farmer didn't believe him at first, but then he went out to the field and saw for himself, and it became kind of at the time, it became a widely, in the Middle Tennessee area, it became a widely reported phenomenon, and it even hit the national news. At the time, Nashville had the old University of Nashville. It's defunct now, but Peabody College and Vanderbilt Medical School actually were originally part of the old University of Nashville, not Tennessee. At any rate, they had a professor come out, a fellow named Troost, and he kind of inspected it. He said, well, it is flesh and it is blood. And didn't much say more than that. Later, after a couple of weeks of people tromping around his tobacco crops and people not wanting to buy his tobacco crop because it was kind of, who wants something that's full of blood and gore? He finally let out that his slaves had invented the whole story. And the thing is, in those days, no slave in their right mind would invent something that would get them punished severely. So I kind of think what really happened was he saw that his crop was in danger of not being sold or harvested. Yeah. And he kind of let that out. And then quickly everybody just took that at face value and let the story drop. But some of the eyewitness descriptions kind of lead me to believe that what they were telling was true. One newspaper reporter noted that the droplets on the leaves of tobacco made a kind of a radial pattern. Now, these days they have experts try it at criminal trials who are what they call blood splatter experts. Mm-hmm. If you go through a field, say you got a cup full of blood, and you start sprinkling it left and right on tobacco plants, it'll most likely leave a teardrop pattern because it's going sideways. The only way to get a radial drop is if it's coming vertically from out of the sky. And that's what the reporter noticed about the droplets on the tobacco plants. So we have actual forensic evidence that it was genuine. Why? How? Nobody knows.
We don't know if it was human or animal or what it was.
No, there was back in this was in, I think, like the 1840s. 1841. In the 1870s, something similar happened in Bath, Kentucky, and very similar. Now, again, some scientists came out and said, "Oh, it's just Gnostic." Now, Gnostic is evidently a ground fungus that's reddish in color. But then someone else, that was the excuse. And then actually they took a sample to the University of Transylvania. There actually is a Transylvania University up in Kentucky.
Yes.
And they actually did analyze it. What they could determine was that it was the pieces of flesh were animal. They were not plant or anything else. They were not fungus or anything like that. They were actual pieces of meat. Again, you can always, debunkers will always say, well, it was a hoax. Well, why would somebody go to that length to just get, at any rate. Fortean Falls of Blood and Gore are pretty rare. Like I said, those are two from the Middle Tennessee area that you probably could count genuine falls of blood and gore maybe on two hands or less that I've come across.
Very strange.
But they do have, very strange. Of course, Nashville, the University of Nashville. If you go downtown on 2nd Avenue, where there's a bunch of city office buildings on 2nd Avenue South, with a big stone wall around it, that is the old campus of the University of Nashville. And one of the original campus buildings is still in existence in the back. It's a kind of a gray limestone building. I'm not sure what they call it. It was originally the military school for the University of Nashville. There was a professor from the University of Nashville who is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with spontaneous human combustion.
Yes, sir.
Or SHC.
Yes, sir.
Never experienced it, thank God. But.
Never personally, but I've heard of it.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of a rare phenomenon. People suddenly burst into flame and are like consumed in a very, very hot fire. But it's very concentrated. It's like they found people who were sitting in their chair and maybe their legs are intact and maybe the top of their head and their top of their torso, but the whole middle is like was consumed by fire, but the whole room didn't burn. It's just almost like a laser or something very, very intense, very hot, but not widespread. There again, scientists try to explain it away. I think Arthur C. Clarke's had dealt with it one, and he had some scientists who claimed it was kind of like a human burrito. That's the best way to describe it. And he was saying that it always happens to alcoholic fat people, and that their clothes contain the fire, so it's like a slow burning fire, as if you lit a burrito on fire. I mean, I'm trying to give the scientific explanation, which makes as little sense as possible. But
right.
If you want to grasp for explanations, that's the scientific explanation. A human burrito. And they claim, they're just people who are alcoholic or overweight and they burst into fire or something. The professor who burst into fire at the University of Nashville back in the early 1800s, I don't have a photo of him, but the fact that he died of tuberculosis tells me that he probably wasn't very heavy. Tuberculosis is kind of a wasting disease, and people are usually it takes them a long time to die, but they're usually very thin. At any rate, he didn't die of spontaneous combustion. He was taking meteorological measurements one morning. It was a cold morning, and suddenly felt something on his leg, and there was like a jet of flame coming out of his ankle. Now, if anybody knows anything about spontaneous human combustion, it is so hot that if you try to put water on it, it actually spreads because, like phosphorus, it'll actually convert the water to hydrogen and oxygen. Fortunately, what he did was he would at first try to pat it, and then he cupped it over, and fortunately, it stopped before it spread to his entire body. But he, being a scientist, he inspected it analytically, and it wasn't, the flame did not come on his clothing from the outside. It was on from the inside out. So it actually, the jet of flame was actually coming from his body, burning through his clothes. And he did publish, there was a scientific report published. It took me quite a while to dig up the report. I got, not his report, but the secondhand report in a scientific journal. But so Nashville has the distinction of having the only scientific observation of spontaneous human combustion. So
Wow. You learn something new.
we're
every
unique
day.
in that regard, and that's also in the Strange Tales. That was my first book.
The David
So-
Lang disappearance. I've heard that that's actually fake. Or am I may be thinking of another one, but wasn't that based on an Ambrose Bierce story?
Well, yeah. See, I'm also an Ambrose Bierce fan. So, you know, I just wrote my latest book. In fact, is now it's not paranormal. It's a straight up biography of Ambrose Bierce's wartime career.
Nice.
And believe it or not, Ambrose Bierce was in and out of Nashville throughout the Civil War.
Yes, he was primarily in the Western Theater. Yeah.
Yeah. He was in the Army of the Cumberland. He was in the 9th Indiana Volunteers. And so his unit was, when they weren't out campaigning, they were, their base was here in Nashville. But I think some of his taste for the weird was picked up as a result of his wartime experiences. He did write one ghost story. His unit was stationed in south of Murfreesboro or west of Murfreesboro for about 6 months in 1863, early 1863. And he wrote a ghost story about a night patrol by cavalry. And the funny thing is, a lot of his stories, his fiction stories, he changes the names to protect the guilty. In this case, he mentioned the actual officer in charge, and I looked it up in the official reports. It's like of the Union and Confederate armies, it's like 136 big bound volumes, and there are patrol actions of the third. I think it was the 3rd Ohio Cavalry. I'd have to consult one of my books to give you the details. But long and the short of it is, while there's numerous patrol reports, none of them report the ghost story that Bierce tells. But then again, if you were the officer in charge and something strange happened to you while on patrol, I don't think you put it in the official report either. So, back to what you're talking about with David Lang and Ambrose Bierce. The thing is, Bierce was familiar with Nashville and Middle Tennessee, very, very much so from his wartime experiences. The difficulty of crossing a field, I think, was the name of his short story.
Yeah, that's it.
And what he did was he changed a lot of the details. He put it before the Civil War in, I think, Alabama, and changed some of the names. But anybody familiar with the David Lang story can tell that he based it on the David Lang disappearance. The trouble with the David Lang story is it was written about in 1953 in a paranormal magazine. But researchers since then the guy who wrote the original story, he fabricated a lot of details. He was a kind of a fiction writer, screenwriter for Hollywood. So he kind of elaborated on the story. The thing is that he didn't invent the David Lang story. It goes back before him, actually, to the 1880s. The trouble, I haven't put it in any of my books yet because I have yet to track down the original article. A fellow named, he wrote by the name of Orange Blossom, wrote the original story. And he was his actual name was Mulhattan. And he was a teller of tall tales, let's put it that way. But the thing about Mulhattan was he would take a grain of truth and then he would kind of spin a very plausible tale around it, especially after he'd had a few drinks. And he was very fond of drinking. And he was a traveling salesman. So he picked up a lot of stories in his travels, one of which he picked up when he was, there was heavy rains in Gallatin one year, and he was stranded at the hotel in Gallatin for about a week or so. Because the roads were washed out. And that's when he heard about David Lang, and wrote about it in the National, not the National, it's the Cincinnati Enquirer. Now, the thing is, the Cincinnati Enquirer was owned by the family of Bierce's former brigade commander, General Hazen. So I think, and Bierce himself was a newspaper editor. So in those days, they didn't have AP or any of the press services. So they basically would pirate each other's articles in newspapers around the country and reprint them. And that's probably where Bierce picked up the story. And he turned it into fiction. But the story goes back to the 1880s. Now,
what's the basic outline of the story?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
The basic outline of the story.
Yeah. That's where you got the basic outline of the story. The David Lang story, people have tried to track down David Lang, documentary. There are no, in the census reports, there are no Langs in Sumner County in the 1880s. However, did come across some tax rolls where somebody had written down the notation, long parentheses Lang, and there were a couple of Long families, Long, in Sumner County in that period. And it struck me that a Yankee drummer traveling through, hearing a story about Lang, might have heard it, to northern ears, it might have been Long, just a southern drawl. I've yet to kind of nail it down because I have yet to come across the Orange Blossom article about the disappearance, but it's out there somewhere. Again, some of these old paranormal tales, I like to nail down chapter and verse and get corroboration before I put them in print because contrary to what the publisher says, my books are nonfiction paranormal stories.
Because if you could find out those people actually exist, it would lend some kind of credibility to it.
Well, I know that there were several Long families in Sumner County at the time. Whether one of them disappeared is another case entirely. So I haven't put the nails in the coffin yet. So.
Well, I want to get into this idea of that this book, Strange Tales of the Dark and Bloody Ground, is kind of based around. Where does that phrase, the dark and bloody ground, come from?
Oh, well, that does refer to the Mid-South. It goes back to frontier days. Before any whites actually settled in Nashville or Kentucky, they around 1775, they had a powwow with the Cherokee Indians to purchase the lands on the other side of the mountains. They were in the Appalachians back then, and no whites had set up any settlements on the other side of the mountains. So they had a powwow with the Cherokees and traded, I guess it was 40 wagon loads of trade goods in return for the purchase of, or what they thought they were purchasing was the land on the other side, which included southern Kentucky and the Cumberland Valley. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like everybody was okay with that deal, except one fella named Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe stepped up and he condemned the deal in no uncertain terms. And he said, this is the dark and bloody ground. And whether he was threatening them with blood and gore, or whether it was just a prophecy that no good would come of selling the land to the whites, is kind of debatable. But he Dragging Canoe, the Cherokee leader, was the one who coined the term dark and bloody ground. This is the dark and bloody ground. You
said there was a taboo about inhabiting some of this area with the Cherokees?
Yeah. Well, and now Dragging Canoe, I should point out, later split off from the main band of the Cherokee, main tribe, and formed the Chickamauga Indians. Mm-hmm. So when you hear about Chickamauga or the Chickamauga Indians, they're actually a branch of the Cherokee, and their leader was dragging canoe. And when I wrote, I also wrote a book on Civil War ghost tales about, and besides the story, the biography of Bierce, somehow it's gotten into the literature that Chickamauga means river of blood. It means no such thing. Now, you can debate the meaning of Chickamauga, but it existed long before the Battle of Chickamauga. It does not mean river of blood. That's just the area where the battle took place, Chickamauga Creek. Just a minor point, but
I know it well.
Yeah, the dark and bloody ground refers to basically the Mid-South area, southern Kentucky and the Cumberland Valley. And so after they made the deal, they were unfazed by Dragging Canoe's curse, and Daniel Boone led the first group over the mountains to settle in Kentucky, and then another fellow named James Robertson, well, two guys, James Robertson, John Donaldson, led the second group to settle what's now Nashville in the Middle Tennessee area. So that's how it got started.
And you said there was a taboo, though, against occupying the area to the Cherokees because of, I guess, the relations to the ancient ones who were here before, we would call now the Mississippian mound builders.
The Nashville, the whole Cumberland Valley was, first of all, it was communal Indian hunting grounds. And evidently when the Cherokees sold the land to the whites, they neglected to tell them that the Chickasaw Indians actually owned the territory. They sold them land that they didn't own. And it was also communal hunting lands for all the tribes. But it was literally the happy hunting grounds because there were thousands upon thousands of graves in this area. There may have been a taboo because it was sacred because this was where a lot of Native Americans had been buried.
Right.
There were also a lot of Indian mounds built. Centennial Park had a couple of pyramids where the Jefferson Street Bridge in East Nashville there was a ceremonial complex where that was put. And bit by bit, they've bulldozed all the Indian mounds. The one mound up there here in Sumner County on Center Point Road, just a few years ago, they put a couple of houses on it. I drove back. This is before they built those expensive new homes. One summer night, we were driving along there, and it's a big conical mound up, like I said, on Center Point. And it was the middle of summer, and something odd to me, maybe it might not have been odd to anybody else, but there were millions, I don't mean thousands, I mean millions of fireflies all congregating around the Indian mound. And I just stopped because it was amazing. They were all focused on the area around the mound. And I stopped the car, and there's no cars coming in either direction. My wife started to get freaked out. But if you drove a few hundred yards up the road or down the road, no fireflies. But right around that old Indian mound were, like I said, millions of fireflies, and it was in the middle of summer. I can't explain it, but maybe it was just they liked the mound. Who knows? I think it was weird, but
there's something about those things, about those mounds. There's something about them that is otherworldly in a way.
Yeah. I never was able to get any look. The Center Point Mound was well known to the people in the area, but I never could get any stories about it.
Huh.
And I just wonder, building your home on top of an Indian mound, what if the folks who moved in there a few years ago have had anything odd happen to them? But I'm speculating.
That's kind of like asking for it, right?
Yeah,
That's how like Poltergeist started.
exactly, like Poltergeist. Build your house over a graveyard. Yeah. But the thing about graveyards, normally they don't have a lot of paranormal activity until you start disturbing graves.
Well,
then you start getting.
Isn't there a connection to the Bell Witch and an Indian mound?
Yeah, one of the explanations as to why the Bell Witch started haunting the Bell family had to do with the kids started, and up there on the Red River, there were Indian mounds in that area too, and they started digging up Indian mounds looking for souvenirs and stuff, and they actually brought back like a tooth or something. It's back to the house, and their father got angry. Don't desecrate Indian graves, and he threw. I think the story goes that he threw the tooth out the window, or landed on between the floorboards and went under the house, something like that. Anyway, to this day, the tooth is out there.
So you have all this mythology and legend, and then you have the backdrop of the Civil War that happened later, and so does all this kind of coalesce to create a? Do you think that the Tennessee area is really kind of like a hotbed of paranormal activity and hauntings?
Yeah, well, you have first Dragon Canoe lays a curse on the whites for settling the area. And bear in mind, from about 1780 on to at least 1795, there was almost continuous Indian warfare in the Mid-South. The Cherokee would raid the settlements here, then the Creek Indians, the Chickasaw. The Chickasaws at first were some of the most violent against the settlers, but they later came to terms with them. But none of the tribes were particularly happy about, like we said, their happy hunting grounds being settled by the whites. And over the years, as the city and the region grew, more and more Indian graves were desecrated and disturbed, which I don't think was a good thing. And even after the Indian Wars, then Nashville and Middle Tennessee became a major battleground during the Civil War. I think the only state that had more Civil War battles than Tennessee was Virginia. And I guess a lot of the people who've moved here in recent years don't realize that within 90 minutes of downtown Nashville, there are 5 major battlefields, and that's not counting the raids and skirmishes and minor attacks, but the major pitched battles, 5 major battles in Middle Tennessee. So that's a lot of battles for one small area.
Yes, it is. And then you get down to Chattanooga, and you've got, several battles down in that area.
Oh yeah, well, you got a whole bunch there too. Chickamauga and the siege of Chattanooga, and Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, all of those. So it's Tennessee in general. It was amazing. Like I said, they were fighting, and in East Tennessee they didn't have as many pitched battles, but what you had was East Tennessee was Unionist, occupied by the Confederates. West Tennessee was Confederate, occupied by the Union.
Mm-hmm.
So in the West Tennessee, you had Confederate guerrillas attacking the Union troops. In East Tennessee, you had Unionist guerrillas attacking the Confederate Confederate army. So there was a lot of vicious infighting. I mean, vicious. They like to portray the Civil War as this honorable, and everybody was gentlemanly and stuff like that. Not in Tennessee. It was pretty nasty at times.
It was very much brother against brother here. Yeah.
Oh, very much. Yeah. And Ambrose Bierce wrote several stories based on that. He was not posted to East Tennessee, but his unit, the 9th Indiana, was. So he wrote a couple of stories based on that, and also a couple of ghost stories too. So he And a lot of his stories revolve around. There was one story where he has the commanding officer orders his captain or lieutenant to fire on this mansion, which turns out to be his wife's home, and he's ordered to fire on his own family. Stories like that, and a lot of Ambrose Bierce's fiction is actually based on his real experiences during the war. There's one obscure little story I came across that wasn't in any of the anthologies about a body that had a bullet right through the center of its head at Stones River. And because it was very cold the night after the battle, they stole the blanket that was covering the body. And the next morning, the body was all curled up like he kind of gotten cold in the night. But Bierce left it open whether the man had somehow survived having a bullet in the middle of his forehead or whether he died of exposure. But a lot of Bierce's stories are kind of verging. You can't tell whether they're supernatural or just very strange. He kind of always left you wondering. He also had a weird sense of humor too. So he liked to. He also wrote The Moonlit Road, which is also based in Nashville, about a seance.
Oh, really?
At any rate, oh yeah.
Huh.
Anybody, if you can find almost any of Bierce's stories online. Go look up The Moonlit Road. It's one of his better ghost stories, and he wrote quite a few ghost stories.
Are you familiar with the house that is? You have to tell me where this is, Sergio, because I don't quite remember. The one next to the old funeral home next to the Parthenon.
Yes.
Yeah,
it was.
It's supposed to be haunted. The funeral home there, right on the edge of the Parthenon on Centennial Park, is supposed to be haunted.
It was built for Ben Allen's wife after he passed. And he was kind of a local figure who's very involved with spiritualism. And there's an original piece of stained glass that's still on that I always thought was curious as I was growing up. That appears to be like some kind of, looks like a Eye of Horus kind of thing that you find in a lot of Masonic symbolism, but it has these like weird curling snakes around it. I always thought it was kind of strange. And I actually saw something very similar recently in like this strange sigil of, what is it, Adam? Do you remember what it is? It's some kind of Babylonian magic, like a sigil of Tiamat or something.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yep.
It's real strange. Are you familiar with Ben Allen stories and the thing that they?
No, I'm not familiar with the stained glass. I'd heard about the funeral home being haunted, but not picked up about Ben Allen and the stained glass.
Do you have any stories about the funeral home being haunted?
No, I've read, somebody else wrote about it, and I'd read that, but I haven't written about it myself. But your story about the stained glass, I need to check that out because that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'll definitely share it with you. It's
my
wild.
graduate work was in Assyria and then Babylonian archaeology. So
that's right up your alley. Then I'll definitely send you some info on it.
Yeah, well, ancient Near Eastern studies, Egyptology and Assyriology. So
sounds like we could do a whole other show on that.
Yeah. Well, that's a long. That's a very involved subject. But but
the first story I turned to in this book, it was kind of a coincidence because I'm in the construction industry and we're doing some new building on Vol Lane in South Nashville. And
Vaulx, V-A-U-L-X.
Yeah, how do you actually pronounce it? Because I've never heard it. Is it Vaulx?
I think it's Vaulx, but I wouldn't swear to it because I read it, but I think it's Vaulx. But
because of the weird spelling, we're all working there and we're all trying to figure out how to say it. And when I got a hold of your book, I immediately found the story about the Breeze Hill Mansion, and I get former General Vol, who had whose plantation, I guess all of that was on the grounds of, and that it was haunted apparently and finally torn down. But that was very interesting.
It was the Vaux Mansion. It was finally torn down, but it was a favorite. Back I researched like back in old newspapers for years and years, decades and decades. It was a favorite. Any newspaper reporter was stumped for a Halloween story would invariably go over to the Vaux house and do something on that. So there was a lot of material on it. And at various times, like it'd been a hangout for hippies, so they were doing a lot of drugs in the house. And eventually, somebody tried to restore it, but they started getting real serious hauntings. There was one where they'd hear a body tumbling down the stairwell, and the story was that it'd been a Confederate Union, I think it was a Union spy or who was spying on the Confederates, and she leaned over too far to hear what they were saying down on the first floor and fell to her death. Other people have gone in, would go into the mansion, and suddenly they look outside, and the modern city had disappeared, and it was just countryside like it had been in the 1800s.
Ooh. Oh, that's
they basically transport back in time. So there's a lot of weird stories about the Vaux Mansion, and someone eventually conducted like a what do they call it? A cleansing, a house cleansing, and evidently that seemed to get rid of the ghosts. But the minute they cleansed it of the ghosts or spirits or whatever was haunting the place, the house immediately started to fall apart. Like physically.
Wow.
So evidently, whatever paranormal power was in there was keeping it preserved.
And it was apparently a hospital or just served as a temporary hospital during the Civil War?
Well, bear in mind, during the Battle of Nashville, the Union Army commandeered Nashville very early in the war and turned almost all of downtown.
Right.
Commandeered all the businesses, and most of them were turned into hospitals. Mm-hmm. Which is why the Honky Tonks on Lower Broad and 2nd Avenue, the old buildings, the ones that date to the Civil War, have so many ghosts in them. Almost all those Honky Tonks down there on Lower Broad have some ghost story to tell. Some of them are from a little later, but a lot of them date to the time of the Civil War. And so, they've collected various ghosts over the years, some country and western ghosts too. Like Tootsie's has got the ghost of a couple of country western ghosts allegedly haunted, and same thing with the Ryman. But the older buildings, like I said, the ones that were converted into hospitals, you had thousands of Union Union wounded coming back, and in those days, they chop off a limb, and a lot of times you didn't survive the cure.
Yeah.
So.
Well, something we've been interested in for a while, and that we've been discussing recently is the whole Bell Witch stuff. And something that we've been studying recently, there's this location called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah that we found similarities with kind of the Bell Witch mythos, and that there's this assortment of paranormal phenomenon, not just ghosts, but also like cryptozoological things like big dogs, black dogs, floating orbs or lights, and all this kind of different paranormal activity all happening in one place. So we saw a parallel with the Bell Witch phenomenon.
Besides the poltergeist activity, before they started getting the physical attacks on the family, they cited weird animals, like I think a two-headed bird of some sort, and then there was a black dog that started hanging around.
Yeah.
So there was, and after the Bell Witch supposedly left that area in around Adams, it's had ghost lights and other strange things happen for years. I mean, still do, from what I understand.
It's
when
a
I went
strange
up,
feeling
it's been a while
place.
since.
The place has a strange feeling about it. Adams in general.
Yeah, and although the original stories don't mention anything about the cave, the Bell Witch Cave is tied in with that, and if you go in there, it ends a certain length in, but you can tell that the cave has collapsed. That originally went a lot further in there, and there is a shaman's grave in there. So the Native Americans believed the cave had certain powers. Otherwise, they wouldn't have buried somebody in there. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there are thousands of graves in the area, but there aren't that many Indian graves in caves. So the assumption is that is the grave of an Indian shaman, a medicine man, who chose to be buried in there. So there's a possibility his spirit is also kind of residing there too. So
the Bell Witch story is interesting in that it's become really like a piece of American folklore, but at the same time, there's definitely like a kernel of truth to it.
Oh yeah,
and it usually is so like the title Bell Witch is kind of confusing to a lot of people because they always attribute that to like Kate Batts, but there's a lot of scholars have looked into it, so this Kate Batts really had nothing to do with it.
No, well, they always denied that, and I worked with a lady who was a descendant of the Batts family, and she says the villain of the piece was really John Bell. But again, when you go back, one family says one thing and the other family says the other. So, yeah, and allegedly Andrew Jackson investigated it himself. There's two different accounts of, and again, it's kind of hard to verify whether Jackson actually visited, but it's something that he and his in-laws were like to carouse a little bit. There's evidence that his wife's brothers and brothers-in-law were fond of their hard drink. So he and they would party sometimes. So it's likely that they did visit the Bell Witch, the Bell family, let's put it that way, and investigate it. Whether or not the stories are 100% true, they're plausible. Let's put it that way.
Another thing that you get into in this book is you have some of, I guess, what you call the woolly booger. Is that how you pronounce it? It's like a Sasquatch.
That's what it's called. The woolly booger is another name for Bigfoot. Now, for some reason, the Northwest, Oregon and Washington seem to get the most attention from cryptozoologists and Bigfoot hunters. And lately, I've kind of shied away from some of that because there's so much junk being put on TV these days about it. But Middle Tennessee, again, the Cumberland Valley and the Cumberland Plateau have over the years had, and also East Tennessee too, have had a lot of reports of Bigfoot. He goes by different names. Woolly booger, the Tennessee stink ape is another one I like. Now, and also I believe the Wilpus wallopus may be related, although that, again, it's some of these stories kind of go back to Indian times, reporting strange creatures. You can't always pin down that it's Bigfoot. The earliest Bigfoot sighting, and this is in, I think, in Dixie Spirits, which is a I wrote 2 books on Tennessee ghosts, Strange Tales of the Dark and Bloody Ground and Ghosts and Haunts of Tennessee. But Dixie Spirits is kind of a ghost sampler for the South in general. And in North Carolina, of course, you have the mystery of Virginia Dare and the Roanoke colony.
Right.
Now, one odd thing, when they finally did come back to take care of the Roanoke colony, they, of course, disappeared. But reports later surfaced that the settlers had gone up into the mountains where they lived hunting mountain apes. Now, there are no apes known to North America, but evidently in the early, Elizabethan reports, they heard reports that the Roanoke settlers were living, hunting up in the mountains on mountain apes. So, what are mountain apes? And that's in the old records too. So, evidently there was something up there that resembled either an ape man or a man ape. In the Appalachians. That's in Dixie Spirits. It mainly relates to the Roanoke colony, but like I said, I came across that odd entry in some of the early records, and I said, "Whoa, mountain apes! Boy, that kind of sounds like Bigfoot to me." But and in the cryptozoology thing, there's this big debate whether Bigfoot is a man ape or an ape man. Yeah, I don't get into that.
Or an interdimensional being.
Yeah.
Or that's the other thing. There is that crossover between UFO sightings and sightings of Bigfoot. That he often appears in areas where there have been numerous UFO sightings. So.
Do we have anything like that around here, like UFO and Bigfoot sightings together that you know of?
Not that I know of, but I wouldn't be surprised. Let's put it that way.
I know Pennsylvania has a lot.
Yeah, and then you also have weird creatures like West Virginia has its Mothman. So that I also discussed that in Dixie Spirits, because that they even made a movie out of Mothman.
We talked to the screenwriter that wrote that movie, the screenplay writer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Richard
he obviously took literary license to make a compelling story, but and I think Jeepers Creepers series of horror movies is probably loosely based on Mothman as well. But Mothman
and Spring Hill Jack maybe a little bit too.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's been a couple of sightings of something like a Mothman in Middle Tennessee.
So I've heard.
Down in Williamson County.
Yes.
A couple of sightings.
Whoa.
Again, I report what people have said they saw. I haven't seen it myself, so I can't swear to 100%. But on the other hand, who's to know? There's a lot of strange things that are going on that science doesn't want to deal with because they can't explain it.
Another one Adam was familiar with was the green ghoul of Chickamauga, or Old Green Eyes. Is that what it is?
Yeah, Old Green Eyes.
Old Green Eyes. Yeah.
I grew up hearing about Old Green Eyes.
I talked to one when I was dealing with the. I don't know whether it was Strange Tales or Ghosts and Haunts of the Civil War. I came across one fellow who from Chattanooga area, and he evidently had a personal encounter with Old Green Eyes. When he was young, a lot younger. Evidently, the Chickamauga battlefield used to be a good place for young couples to go make out. And he was on Snodgrass Hill with his date, and they were evidently communicating intensely, shall we say, when something crawled on the back of his sedan, and he couldn't make out what exactly it was, but he said that there was these two green eyes, and they were set farther apart than a human would be, and they're two glowing green eyes. and he could even feel the warmth of the breath on him. He had a convertible, and that was enough for him. They suddenly stopped making out, and he put his car in gear and got the hell out of there real fast. So, I do have one eyewitness account of having experienced whatever it is, green eyes. There's different explanations. One is that a creature that after the battle, there were so many dead lying about that he went about devouring the bodies of the dead and maybe the wounded. The other is that the least credible is that the icon or image of one of the Union brigades was a tiger, and that the statue of the tiger comes to life and prowls the grounds. I tend not to believe that.
Damn Yankees.
Then there's also the. I'm sorry.
I said, "Damn Yankees."
Yeah. Well, that's. I think somebody invented that because it sounded good. There is a monument to one of the Union brigades, and and the image of a crouching tiger, but
Yeah, I've seen that monument. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. I don't believe that one. On the other hand, the possibility that some large creature after the battle, you have all this fresh meat on the battlefield, was going around kind of gnawing on the bodies is not beyond belief. And there are a lot of other ghost stories related to Chickamauga battlefield too. So,
see, I was always told there was always this contention, and it depended on who you spoke to in Chattanooga and that North Georgia area, was that either Green Eyes was a ghost or he was some kind of weird cryptid creature. And that story would change from person to person. Yeah.
Well, I'm not surprised. Like I said, I've heard different explanations, that it was like the green ghoul was like a human-like creature, two-legged, or that it was a four-footed creature like a mountain lion or a tiger or something like that. So, and the fella that I talked to, his experience, he couldn't see the outline of the body, but just from the eyes being set far apart, he concluded it was some kind of large predatory feline. So
that's interesting.
He actually experienced it. So now again, it's late at night, and you can't. All he saw were the two glowing green eyes, but it's real. Let me put that. Whatever it is, it's real.
I want to ask you.
And that also gets us into the Wampus cat, but I haven't.
Oh yeah, the Wampus cat.
Yeah, well, that's again, you have folklore merging with fact, merging with fantasy. So trying to sort all that out is sometimes difficult because while they're the green ghoul is not the Wampus cat. That's another feline creature of the Mid-South. But it's an interesting cryptid, let's put it that way.
The Chattanooga airship. Because this was a total new one on me, like I said.
Well, and it's documented in the papers. And again, I've also written about UFOs in Dixie Spirits and a couple of other places too. I think Ghosts and Haunts of Tennessee. I kind of, even though strictly speaking they're mostly ghost stories, I kind of again merge. Sometimes we'll throw in a UFO account, and again, when you have something like ghost lights, where ghost lights are a type of UFO, but they're not spaceships, but they're unexplained phenomenon like that. The ghost, cigars from Mars, whatever you want to call them. the Tennessee Valley was visited back in the early years of the 20th century by over the period of a couple of weeks, actually. Now the thing is, the late 19th and early 20th century reports still describe the mystery airship or a flying cigar, something like that, which, potentially could be they just saw, a dirigible, an airship. But on the other hand, they're describing a phenomenon, aerial phenomenon, in what they could identify with. In other words, they knew airships, they knew lighter than aircraft. The idea that it might be from outer space, didn't even enter their minds. They were mystery airships. But Huntsville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga all had sightings over a period of a week or two. And now the thing is, this is there were I double checked in case maybe somebody was buzzing the Tennessee Valley in an airship. And Jane's All the World's Aircraft is like the authoritative source on all sorts of craft, military and civilian. And back around 1909, 1908, they did publish Jane's All the World's Airships or craft. And while there were a number of airships being developed at that time in the United States, none of them are known to have been built in the Mid-South. It's not beyond technical ability, but some of the descriptions of the speed of the aircraft were beyond now, they weren't flying very fast. They seemed to be cruising up and down the valley, observing whatever the ground, the cities, and one described it as traveling at the speed of a hurricane, which hurricanes, in terms of aerial flight, is not that fast. But no plane and no dirigible in 1910 or 1909 was capable of that speed. So if they're just saying it was traveling at that only a hurricane or tornado could travel any faster, that's still traveling a lot faster than any known aircraft. Now, by the end of World War I, planes were traveling that fast, and dirigibles too, but not in 1909, 1910 in that area. So that's why I credit it as being UFOs. And as far as I know, no explanation ever came forward as to the sightings. Thousands of people did cite the craft flying over their cities. And it even became kind of a running joke sometimes because some bartender invented a drink based on it. But there was no one ever came forward saying, "Oh, that was my airship," or anything like that. Like I said, Jane's All the World's Airships for 1909 lists all manner of lighter than aircraft. And like I said, there were ships on the drawing board, but most of them were a little more than, a gleam in the inventor's eyes. And there were only 4 in actual existence in the United States at that time. So, and none of them could travel more than 25 miles an hour. So
and this was also
we're talking
15 years, I think, or so after the initial airship flap.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah.
Now the trouble is, in the late 19th century, you had board editors in newspapers who it is suspected sometimes invented the stories. Jules Verne came up with a couple of novels about air flight based on lighter than aircraft. and some editors kind of enhanced on that, and just to fill newspaper print, in between ads, did fabricate stories. The trouble is telling apart the actual eyewitness accounts from the editors who like to tell tall tales. This one in the 1909, 1910 is authentic. This is after there was a spate, like I said, in the 1880s, I think it was, there was a spate of mystery airships with it seen mostly the invention of newspaper editors.
Right.
That said, there were also a couple of eyewitness accounts that never made it into the newspapers of having seen mystery cigars, and the whole thing of the cigar shaped UFOs. That was the ones that were reported at that time, but there have been off and on reports of UFOs in the shape of cigars all the way up to the present day. They're just not as common as they used to be, but they still get reported if you track down the literature. So, and I saw one morning I was coming back from taking my wife to work. It was like at 5:30 in the morning, and if it hadn't been a foggy morning, I wouldn't have seen it at all. But I saw some kind of bright object descending at a rapid rate down at a 45-degree angle. This is, like I said, 5:30 in the morning, still dark, and it was foggy, so it glowed even more brightly than normal. And if I hadn't looked up, I wouldn't have seen it, because it was a split second. It was maybe 10 seconds at most that it flashed downward. As near as I can tell, it would have landed in Old Hickory Lake, but I never heard anything in the newspapers about it.
Wow. That's crazy.
So I saw a UFO. I mean, maybe it was a meteor, who knows? But if it's unexplained aerial phenomenon, it's a UFO. Until it gets explained, it's a UFO.
Well, I wanted to ask you if there's to get back, I guess, to the hauntings. Are there particular hauntings of Tennessee that are some of your favorites that you're really interested in?
Well, like I said, I've picked them up over the years, and sometimes it's somebody will tell me one thing and some another, it's hard to kind of pick one. I mean, obviously the Bell Witch is one of my favorites, mm-hmm. and of course everybody else is too. One of the stories, I don't think I did write about in Strange Tales about Tennessee's haunted capital, but I was later told a little bit more by the state curator of another account that the cupola on top of the Capitol building, that little circular thing that they stuck on top of the state capitol. Yeah. Well, when the Union Army occupied the city, they landed troops down on Lower Broadway, and of course the first thing they did was went up to the Capitol and raise a flag over the state capitol. That's given. Well, evidently, according to one legend, Jim Hoobler, who's this, now he takes no, he's just relating the story. He doesn't know whether it's true or not. But supposedly one of the secessionist state legislators, this old gentleman, refused to leave, and he was not going to let the Yankees put the American flag over the state capitol. And he stood up in that it's like a wrought iron circular staircase leading to the flagpole. And he stood on the staircase saying, and with an old flintlock rifle, and he said, "You'll put that flag over the state capitol over my dead body." At which point, from behind the color guard came a shot. One of the soldiers decided to take him up on that and shot him dead, and his body tumbled down around the circular staircase, and they put the flag up over the Capitol building. Supposedly, ever since then, workers inside the state capitol don't like to go up there to do maintenance because they keep seeing a kind of a missed on the wrought iron staircase, and they all think it's the old secessionist state legislator still guarding the staircase. So that's one of several stories about the state legislature. I mean, you know, I don't know if any of the listeners ever remembered Lieutenant Governor Wilder, but he regularly saw ghosts in and inside the state capitol and outside. He was evidently, now, of course, a lot of people attributed it to his frequenting the Oak Room over in the Hermitage Hotel, but he was serious about it. He's claimed to see various ghosts inside the state capitol. Lieutenant Wilder is long gone now, but he was, he was a believer.
And the main story that Nashvillians would be familiar with is the fact that there's two people entombed in the Capitol, right? And it's their ghosts who people think they see.
Yeah, and state troopers and state Capitol police who guard the Capitol grounds at night swear that they've heard. They'll hear some kind of yelling going on and go over there and to see what the disturbance is, and nothing will be there. And we'll see the architect was commissioned to build. They went all out to build the state capitol. They imported German stonemasons, and this architect was brought over and from back east, and they wanted to spare no expense to build it, except that they also didn't want to spend much money. The politicians wanted a first-class capitol, but they appointed an overseer to keep an eye on the architect, so he didn't spend too much money. So the overseer and the architect were always at odds with one another. The architect would want the finest marble, and the overseer would, no, you can get by cheaper than that. And they go back and forth, and that's why the building took so long to build, because the state legislature kept not spending, appropriating the money, and the masons and the other construction workers weren't paid. Finally, after I think about 10 or 12 years, they finally finished it. Maybe longer. I'd have to look it up. Anyway, as a kind of a thank you to the architect for his long work in sticking with the construction of the Capitol, they allowed his body to be interned in the foundations of the Capitol building. And the only other person that they gave that honor to was, of course, the overseer. So the two people who more or less hated each other's guts were buried for eternity next to in the same building. And according to the state troopers and other people familiar with the Capitol, these two guys still go at it through eternity and hate each other's guts, even though they're bound for eternity in the same building.
Still having the same disagreements over and over and over.
Over and over again, we don't know, we don't want marble, then we want granite, and they're going on and on about this, that, and the other through eternity. Well, and there's some poltergeist activity too that I've heard about too, but that's beside the point.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much. I mean, this has been awesome. I mean, it's I don't think we've even scratched the surface of all the material.
That's mostly covered Strange Tales of the Dark and Bloody Ground. I have the sequel to it out, which is Ghosts and Haunts of Tennessee, and that covers a lot about the haunted honky tonks on Lower Broad and a couple other things.
I'm going to have to get that one. Yeah.
Where can people get the books?
Well, they're all in print, so any good bookstore, if they don't have it in stock, they can back order it within a day or two.
Mm-hmm. And what are your plans for the future? Do you have anything in the works you can divulge to anybody? Or?
Well, I've been working on. I also interested in the age of Arthur, the King Arthurs. Been working on a novel on that era, like a historical novel, and also another Civil War book that deals with some leading characters that, because I did a lot of research for the book about Ambrose Bierce, and I call it the period of honorable strife, or actually Bierce called it that. So I'm already did a lot of research for the, especially about the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of Tennessee and the Army of the Tennessee. It gets confusing. The Confederates had their army was called the Army of Tennessee. The Grant's army was called the Army of the Tennessee after the river. So
Yeah.
a lot of people get confused over that. But at any rate, I've got another Civil War book in the works, as well as like I said, I'm trying to convince some publisher about a historical novel dealing with the Age of Arthur. So we'll see.
Well, excellent, Christopher. Thank you so much for doing this. And do you have like a website or just the Amazon?
Yeah,
author page?
I've got two websites. One, I've got several, but one is called Dixie Spirits website, based on I have a book named Dixie Spirits. So one is Dixie Spirits, is the website on WordPress, and the other one is it's dealing mostly with the Civil War. Although then again, here again, because first the Ambrose Bierce, and also I've done a whole book on ghosts and haunts of the Civil War. The late unpleasantness is the website that deals with the Civil War and Civil War ghost stories, things like that.
Okay, cool, excellent. Well, thank you so much, sir, for doing this. Stay on the line for us, and we're going to close this section out, and we'll be right back with a few other extra guests on Conspirinormal. And Rob's ready to go to bed.
It's been a long one. Long 3 or 4, actually.
Yeah, so we just did like hour and 20 minutes with Christopher Coleman, and then we did like another hour and 20 minutes with the guys from Cruising with Steak.
Which was real fun.
Which was fun, yeah. And we're going to put that up on our Patreon feed because some of the language on there isn't appropriate for
for our PG-13 audience.
Yeah, some of our like we got a lot of what is it radio stuff that we kind of have to cater to, so
syndication.
Yeah. So it was a little better to not have Rob like pulling his hair out trying to get out all the F-bombs. That would have been nearly impossible. It would have been just like watching Goodfellas on regular TV. So we'd rather just do it that way. So any insights on Christopher Coleman? Rob, what'd you think of that, man?
Oh, that was great. It's cool to have like a lot of local stuff and hear about places that I know of. And I never heard any of the stories he was talking about either.
Yeah, there was quite a few things in there that were new to me, like the shaman being buried in the Bell Witch Cave.
The Wilson County
I'd never
Blood
heard
Rain.
that before. Yeah, the Wilson County Blood Rain. I heard of the Oliver Lang disappearance. Yeah. What's for you, Sophia? And thank you for setting that up, by the way.
Yeah, man, it was cool. You know, I mean, it's more, there's more ghost stories in it than anything, but I mean, all that Fortiana and the crypto stuff and the airships. I mean, it was kind of the whole, the whole paranormal gamut. So it was real interesting. And, you know, I've been getting more into local history, and when I can combine that with the weird stuff, it's really fun.
Yeah. We're going to continue on with this theme for the next couple of episodes. We've got John Tenney coming on, and then we have Nick Redfern coming on. And hopefully maybe try to squeeze those in before Halloween actually comes. So, but John Tenney, just going to talk to him about some of his cases that he's worked on, and maybe just kind of, talk about any kind of like paranormal subject we kind of want to talk about. We haven't had John on in it's been a while. And the last time we had him on, we talked about the Kennedy assassination. So that was about 3 years ago now. We haven't talked to John about 3 years. And Nick Redfern is coming back. We're going to talk about his book about paranormal parasites. So, which was interesting because when Christopher Coleman was telling us about the green eyes and the two kids going to Snodgrass Hill to make out, there's a section in that book, and I just read that today, actually. So a little bit of a synchronicity, where Nick is talking about these Lover's Lane cryptid encounters. And the idea is they're feeding off of some kind of sexual energy. Yeah. And then Christopher Coleman relates the story that this guy told him about being in this. They're making out on Snodgrass Hill and seeing green eyes on the truck. So
it's very interesting.
Yeah. So I'm a little curious to dig in a little bit more on that. Just weird how something I read today was reflected in something that we talked about.
Man, that Earth Cosmic Coincidence Control Office is turned all the way up tonight.
Yes. And Rob, are you going to survive through the Halloween season?
We'll see. I'm planning on it.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. We're looking forward to your movie night. Getting that screen working over here.
Yeah. What night did I say that was going to be?
Was it like the 28th or something?
And everyone make sure to do due diligence and check your pumpkin for communists.
That's right.
For what?
For communists.
For communists? Yeah.
See the pictures of Nixon and stuff. Look at wasn't it Nixon? I think was with McCarthy looking for.
Oh yeah, yeah.
pumpkins.
The pumpkin with Alger Hitz thing. Yeah,
that's what,
the what is that? You go to the library, the film microfilm, where they had something in a pumpkin patch. Yeah. I was wondering what you were talking about. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to make a funny, man. Trying to make a Halloween joke.
Rob, we just did the Patreon with Cruising with Steak, so tell everybody where they can find our Patreon.
Yeah, we got so many on there. I don't even remember how many at this point. We're doing a lot of extra stuff lately. You go to patreon.com/Conspirinormal for all that bonus content. There's various subscriptions there. If you don't want to subscribe to a monthly fee, you can do a one-time donation on our website at conspirinormal.com. And if you want to contribute to the show, but you don't want to spend money doing it, you can always just do a 5-star review on iTunes and Stitcher or wherever you listen.
And we did have a Patreon named Ed Black that listened to the last Patreon we did with Jenny and Tom. And he said, this was hilarious, even better than the public show. Pays to be a Patreon. Ha ha.
Hey.
So
True.
that's a plug.
Yeah, we get to cut loose on the Patreon.
Yeah, we're a little less formal, and you'll get to hear that with the Cruising with Steak guys. All right, I think that's it, and we'll be back next time for more Halloween weirdness on Conspirinormal.